Hello, colleagues. Greetings from the land of the Kumeyaay people in San Diego, California. I'm happy to be here and talk to you about what I think it means to build a restorative university. What I have in mind for this presentation is a broad application of the concept of restorative justice in higher education, and I do so because I think of universities as significant places for exploration, of course, the life of the mind, but also serving as a guidepost for larger society. So what happens in terms of restorative applications on campus often extends beyond. So I'll be thinking about how to create a restorative community, that is the students, faculty, and staff that all work together on campus, what it means to be a restorative university from the perspective of scholarship, and then also from the perspective of teaching. I'll start with an example. So many years ago now, I was involved with a restorative justice case. This is a case of student misconduct. Two students were invited to a barbecue, and they went to Walmart to pick up supplies. And when they were at Walmart, they found themselves in the gun section of the store. And after perusing the selections for a little while, ended up purchasing this BB gun for $27. It's essentially a toy gun. They drove it back to campus, and the time it took for them to drive from Walmart to campus was the time it took for one of the students, his name was Henry, to get the gun out of its package and stick his arm out the window of the car and test out his new toy. He wasn't shooting at people. He was just trying to see if he could hit some trees as they drove through campus. This is a perhaps uniquely and tragically American story where guns are everywhere, of course. Not surprisingly, the sight of a car and a gun and an arm out the window was disturbing, and very quickly there were emergency calls being placed, and there was a rightful assumption that there was a shooter on campus. These guys were unaware of what was transpiring and what the dispatchers were dealing with, but there was an announcement that went cascaded through campus vehicles, and a campus facilities worker happened to hear the announcement on the radio and saw the boys in their car, cornered them, and they were that was the end of the incident, and they were in trouble. So here's where restorative justice comes in. Under a typical approach, at least at a U.S. university, situation like this might result in a suspension. But in restorative justice, we really try to keep students on campus and have them take active responsibility for the harm that they have caused. So there's first an intake process, or a pre-conference, in which there's an assessment done, and the first questions are really, are these guys willing to take responsibility? Are they admitting that they have caused harm? Which they did. And then there is a restorative dialogue, or conference, and that's captured by these three phases of storytelling, listing harms, and brainstorming solutions. So the first phase is letting them tell their story, what they were thinking at the time, and what they thought about since, and also it's a gathering of harmed parties. So in this case, we invited the guy who had, from facilities, who had cornered them. We invited the dispatcher from the public safety office who was fielding all of the emergency calls, and we sat around the circle trying to identify the different harms that were caused. So of course there was the panic that ensued. Interestingly, the story told by the facilities worker was somewhat transformative, because the boys initially really only thought of him as the person who caught them, meaning if he hadn't, they would not have been in trouble. And so they were resentful initially of him. But what he said was that from his perspective, it looked like they were about to leave or drive off campus, and that he knew that police were headed to campus, and that from his perspective, he thought their lives were in danger. In fact, he himself was a gun owner and quickly discerned that this was not a regular gun, but just a toy gun or a BB gun, despite what it looks like, and knew that they were not really school shooters. So he essentially told them that he was trying to save their lives by stopping them from going off campus, and that was a very moving moment. So next, in the process, once harms have been identified, is figuring out how these guys could take responsibility. Now, interestingly, Henry, one of the two guys, was an international student from England, and Henry said, as part of his storytelling, that he was completely confused or baffled by the situation. That from his understanding, coming from England, he was coming to the land of Second Amendment rights and gun ownership. And the minute he buys a toy gun from Walmart, he gets in trouble for it. So he just did not understand what was permissible in this country. So for him, one of the ways that he wanted to take responsibility was to conduct a workshop for other international students on what was acceptable or unacceptable behavior. There were apologies that they wanted to make to various people, and some other activities that would demonstrate their commitment to the community, including a gun safety campaign or educational campaign about gun violence in America. And then finally, after a conference agreement is reached, there is a mentoring process to assist these guys in making sure that they follow through with their plan. It's a good example of restorative justice in action on campus. Some years ago, I conducted a study, the STAR project, in which we conducted an analysis through various surveys of campus disciplinary processes from a more traditional process and comparing it with various kinds of restorative practices. And one thing I would like to say about the US and student affairs is that conduct administrators are very developmentally focused, meaning that they're mostly interested in helping students learn from the mistakes they've made. So this is not really a comparison between a purely punitive or retributive approach to discipline with restorative justice, but one that is focused primarily on developmental process like motivational interviewing, focusing on how the student's thinking might have deviated from where it should go, and how they could make better decisions in the future. In other words, a more inward look or introspective look at development, and that's compared with restorative justice, which is more outward looking. What is the impact of their behavior on others, and how can they take responsibility for that? Some of the things that we learned from this project is why harm parties choose to participate in these processes, such as that facilities worker or the dispatcher. And these are the kinds of things that they say, that they want to have a say in what happens, to identify how they've been harmed. They want some reassurance that the behavior won't be repeated. They might have specific questions that only the people who caused harm can answer. They want to know if they're sorry. They want something good to come from it. In our study, which is consistent with other studies of restorative justice almost across the board, there's great harm party satisfaction with participation, whether it's their assessment of the fairness of the process or whether they had an opportunity to meaningfully contribute, I like this item that we asked about their comfort level in seeing the students on campus going forward, a great indicator of rebuilt relationships, and their general satisfaction with the process. We also looked at why people who do cause harm participate, and there are 4 major reasons we've discovered. One is reputational, that is, in general, students like Henry don't see themselves as bad people, but they know they're in trouble and know other people are labeling them so, and they want a chance to restore that reputation. They want a chance to explain what happened from their perspective, express their remorse, and they're looking for a pathway out of this situation. So taking responsibility through some kind of agreement is a way for them to move forward. We looked at several dimensions of student development, and across the board we found statistically significant improvements in student development, comparing a restorative justice process with a developmental discipline process. So whether they had a sense of having a voice or taking responsibility or developing the skills to talk across difference, strengthening their relationships to the institution, fairness or ability to move on across the board, there were gains to be had. So let me turn more broadly to what it means to build a restorative campus, and I want to talk about it from 3 vantage points. The first being institutional mission. The second, I assume that these distinctions are similar in the UK, but in the US, academic institutions are roughly divided between academic affairs and student affairs. Academic affairs pertaining to coursework, faculty, what faculty teach, scholarship, and student affairs having to do with the lives of students, where they sleep, where they eat, co-curricular life, the teams they play on, supporting them to be successful in their academic pursuits. Starting with mission, I want to give 2 quick examples. One comes from Yale University, and this is a screenshot of a news article from the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it's saying that Yale had renamed Calhoun College over the namesake's ties to slavery and white supremacy. So essentially, Calhoun College is a residential unit at Yale, and they, like many institutions, were undertaking a restorative process to account for the harm that Calhoun had done, and they were no longer going to celebrate Calhoun's legacy. What was meaningful to me from this story was the statement by the Yale president, Peter Salovey. The decision to change a college's name is not one we take lightly, but John C. Calhoun's legacy as a white supremacist and a national leader who passionately promoted slavery as a positive good fundamentally conflicts with Yale's mission and values. So essentially, where an institution sees alignment between restorative justice and its educational mission, we can see the possibility of integration of restorative efforts like this one. A second, and perhaps more mundane example, but I think meaningful nonetheless, comes from my own institution here at the University of San Diego. It began its restorative justice work over a decade ago, and that work, or the work of student misconduct, was overseen by the USD Office of the Assistant Dean of Students. It's a rather generic sounding office, but the director of the office lobbied to have the office's name changed back in 2012 to the Office of Ethical Standards and Restorative Practices. And I think that this is no small thing, because as directors come and go and an office remains with this title, hiring a new director almost requires that they have a background in restorative justice, that they are committed to that particular philosophy. So let me turn to academic affairs. So this is the work of research, teaching, and also a workplace for faculty and staff. First, there's been an enormous growth in scholarship on restorative justice, and this is a small study I conducted a couple of years ago, just to help me understand my increasing anxiety about how I can no longer keep up with the restorative justice literature. When once there were very few articles published each year, now it appears that over 200 articles in peer-reviewed journals are published. So the university is the site for this increasingly robust evidence base that supports restorative justice work around the world. That's all I'll say about research. Turning to teaching, have a few different points here. One is we can ask, do faculty use restorative practices in the classroom? Is it consistent with pedagogical philosophy? For example, restorative practices often have people sit in a circle and use a talking piece that's passed around the circle to indicate whose turn it is to speak, and just how very different this is from a standard classroom where someone is asked to raise their hand if they want to chime in, meaning that there will always be those who are extroverted and those who are introverted, and not everyone will speak. So a more inclusive participation is indicated by restorative pedagogy. Of course, there is teaching restorative justice in coursework. That's another realm to explore. Take a census on the number of courses available. Some institutions, like our own, are now offering certificates in restorative justice, such as ours in restorative facilitation and leadership, and this is a 3-course sequence. Other institutions have begun offering master's degrees in restorative justice, such as Vermont Law School and Eastern Mennonite University. And I've been lately very interested in this question of integration of restorative justice into key disciplines. For example, in public education, that is kindergarten through high school in the US, restorative justice has become very popular. However, restorative justice has not yet been integrated into teacher education. So teachers have to learn it after they've become teachers and not on the way. That seems like a mistake. Similarly, most US states have restorative justice legislation. It's integrated into the criminal justice system. Yet law schools rarely teach restorative justice, and that seems equally like a problem, and the university has a role to play there. Finally, in terms of academic affairs, I wanted to talk about the university as a workplace and explore the example of a neuroscience professor at the University of Rochester, a leading neuroscience program in this country, who was accused of sexual harassment. The investigation process was perhaps mangled, but after 2 very expensive investigations, this professor was not found in violation of sexual harassment. And I'll highlight here a comment from this news story. The controversy has caused deep divisions within the department. It led to the departure of several of his former colleagues and to the resignation of the university's president, Joel Seligman. This was a huge mess for the university, very expensive, very controversial, lots of anger, lots of fighting, lots of positions. The University of Rochester did undertake a restorative process to help manage the professor's return to the classroom, which is the focus of this headline. That during the investigation, he was on leave, but since he was not found in violation, he was returning. And how would that process be managed? How could people's needs be met? How could the harms caused maybe by him, but also by the investigation process itself be addressed? So the site of the university as a workplace in which people are often in conflict or cause harm is another arena for exploration. Then the third arena I want to explore is student affairs. And here we basically divide the restorative work between community building work and work associated with responding to harm. USD likes to think of itself as a bit of a laboratory for piloting initiatives, and we're often trying new things. So for example, during the pandemic, and when our classes went remote, our orientation team had to figure out how to bring in a new cohort of students to campus, build a sense of community among them without having them physically here. So using online restorative justice circles to build community was essential to their approach. Similarly, residential life, maintaining a sense of community, supporting students who were quarantined through online circles was part of this work. We have seen this done with athletic teams, student clubs, fraternities, sororities, all organized around questions of developing relationships, developing comfort in dialogue, particularly around difficult topics, addressing climate-related issues, such as the nationally contentious issues that were frequent, particularly during the Trump administration here. Responses to harm, campus climate comes up here when there are incidents on campus, such as a racist incident. Even if the perpetrator of that incident is unknown, people are angry, upset, and need places to gather and process and figure out, share ways in which they've been affected and figure out pathways forward given the circumstances. I've already talked about responding to student misconduct. Increasingly, it's being used for a wider and wider range of offenses, from the small-time drinking violations to significant harms, such as sexual assault. And like in the case of the Rochester professor, if students are suspended, we may use restorative practices for their reintegration back onto campus. This is my closing slide, and I essentially want to revisit my BB gun case with Henry and his peer, and think about where restorative justice fits within a broader conception of campus discipline. And I'm drawing here on John Braithwaite's regulatory pyramid. So the general point I want to make with this slide is that restorative justice can be integrated within a system rather than replace it. So for fans of traditional punishment, all is not lost. The main point is that we should be trying restorative justice first. So the first point at the base of the pyramid is around restorative capacity building, and the issue that Henry raised, that coming to the U.S. from England, he simply did not understand what was or was not permissible. And so we treat Henry as if he were a competent actor, capable of learning, in particular, learning the campus weapons policy. So helping him know what the rules are to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the first place. That should work for most people. If it doesn't, then we have a more straight-up restorative justice approach, treating an individual as a moral actor. And that is, once Henry learns that his behavior has affected other people, caused them to go into a state of panic, then he's likely to feel badly about it, feel guilty, and care about it, and respond with something restorative, whether it's his apology or the gun safety campaign or whatever other steps he might take to make amends. If that doesn't work, we can still fall back on deterrence, which assumes a rational actor, meaning I don't really care about other people, but I don't want to get in trouble. So I'm going to conduct a cost benefit analysis on whether it's worth it to me to engage in this behavior. So in this case, maybe there's a fine associated with violating the campus weapons policy. If you bring a BB gun on campus, you'll be subject to a fine, and so that is the deterrent effect. That's an unfortunate shift, because if we calibrate this wrong, if the fine is $1, then Henry might say, oh, for $1, it's worth it to me to shoot this gun on campus and cause a lot of panic. So it's not ideal, but it can work. And then finally, if we can't reason with Henry or someone else, that's when we use incapacitation, right? So we're treating them as unpersuadable, and so we have to stop them or remove them from the community. Hopefully, that's a last resort. Okay, I hope that it helps, and I thank you for considering the idea of restorative justice for your campus.